All right. Hey guys. Let's see if anybody's here. Okay, I want to spend a little bit of time going over the history of Bitcoin. And I'm going to use this book that Ben Sigmund and I wrote. Obviously, I'd love for you to buy this book. We still have, I think, about 400 copies left. And there probably will never be another copy of this book. It's really a work of art, if I may say so myself. But I want to go over the entire book with you guys online, just showing you this book. Because I want to cover, some of you won't buy it, it's expensive. This book costs over $150 to make and design and everything. It's expensive, I get it. A lot of you won't buy it. But let's just go over, I want to go over the history of Bitcoin and why. I'm going to try to really just impress on you why you need to buy Bitcoin. And it's going to be a little bit of a long kind of explanation, but I want to explain it. The best way I know how to explain it is through this book. So basically, and this is a numbered first edition, right? So this is copy 1 out of 1,000. And, we created this book with the idea that, it'd be something to kind of like Bitcoin itself, something that's finite and scarce like Bitcoin. And we made 1,000 first editions and 1,100 second editions, so a total of 2,100 books. And that's it. That's the only number that there will ever be. And so, this is the quote that we found amazing. This is the quote that Satoshi told Dan Larimer, actually, who I know. He said, if you don't believe me or you don't get it, I just don't have time to explain it to you to try to convince you. Sorry. And he said that in 2010. Our thing is, well, we do have time to convince you, so let's try. Let's try to convince you. Let's try to make you believe that Bitcoin is amazing. So, let's get to here. And really, well, we would say there's a lot of books on Bitcoin. When we started writing this, we were like, well, should we even write a book on Bitcoin? Do we have anything to add to it? And we sort of said, well, we probably do, because none of these books are visual books. So, they don't treat Bitcoin as sort of this cultural paradigm. And we felt that there was something visual about Bitcoin, that all these memes about Buffett calling it rat poison squared, about the history of the ideas and the people behind Bitcoin who even before Bitcoin started, who influenced the thing of Bitcoin. So that's why we felt that this book is very different. So and by the way, you can see here already it looks very different. So this paper is the highest quality museum quality paper that can be found. It's printed by a really bespoke printer called Typecraft in Pasadena that we found. We literally went over 10 different printers all over the world, including Italy, to see if we could get this thing done. We chose this printer, and one of the reasons we chose it is Ben and I are both in Los Angeles. When we wanted to go to the printer, and we had to go probably 10 times to get this book printed the way we wanted. So it's incredibly time consuming. You just can't even imagine how time consuming this is. And everything from the colors, this cyan, for example, this had to be the exact color, and to the binding, which was actually printed in Roswell, Arizona, and this embossed thing by a Bible printer, one of the very few people who can do these kind of print jobs today. So books are obsolete. Nobody buys books anymore. Nobody reads books. But I'm obsolete, so I felt like, hey, this is a good choice. So each of these chapter headings we made over kind of a double spread like this. And the first thing we wanted to get is, what is the motivation for Bitcoin? Why did people come up with Bitcoin? Why was there even a need to create this instrument? And so really, it comes down to separating money and state, or bank and state. So, ever since the the Medicis and even the Romans, there always was this notion that the state issued the money and we issue these tokens. You're going to use the tokens for transactions. And if we want to issue more tokens to ourselves to go to war or to, for a major construction project or something, we'll just do that, right? And so that's the way money works right now. And the US is currently doing this with its dollar. It is printing dollars and forcing people to use these dollars. And that has benefited America in some sense, but it's made America very, very lazy. It always makes the country very lazy to do it because it's why actually work when you can just issue money? It's so much faster, so much more convenient, right? Now, here's a quote by Alan Greenspan, and this is a great picture. And by the way, every single one of these pictures was licensed. This is probably, we think, one of the best pictures of Greenspan. And, while there were other cheaper ones, we went to the extreme lengths of getting the license rights for these pictures. So this quote is amazing. It says, "The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default." And you see this same quote that is being said. Fed Kashkari said the same thing. Hey, we have infinite amount of money at the Federal Reserve. We can print whatever we want. There's no chance of us defaulting on the dollar because we'll just print more. And that's Alan Greenspan. And so Alan Greenspan, actually started as a gold bug. And, he was then hired by Reagan, and he basically, by Volcker, sorry, he was then the predecessor to Volcker, and he changed his tune completely and became an advocate of fiat currency. So what's the problem with fiat currency? Well, here's the problem. The big problem is we're just drowning in debt, right? So this is the total global debt. And as you can see, it went from 220 trillion in 2015 or 2014 to now 281 trillion now. And as a share of GDP, we've gone from 300% of GDP to 355% of GDP after COVID. So basically, debt is objectively growing out of control as a percentage of our economies. We have a major debt problem, right? And this is going nowhere but up. We're always increasing the amount of debt in the economy. And that's the problem. We're drowning in debt. And people saw this early on and they're like, well, what's the problem with that? Well, here's the problem with it. And this is a custom graph that Lee Stephan did. We took graphs that were readily available, but we transformed them into this to make this thing really great like this. And so you can see here, the money printing M2 is going up like this, but the top 0.1% of net worth, which includes me, is also growing very similar to the money printing curve. So there's no problem if you're in the ultra high net worth category, no problem whatsoever. But what if you're in the bottom percent? Well, if you're in the bottom 50%, you're not competing at all, right? Your net worth in dollar terms is getting debased relative to the money printing. So it's very simple. The people who lose out are the bottom 50%. And so this is called the Cantillon effect, and it's named after the person who discovered it. It was the Scottish-French economist in the 1700s who discovered this. And I actually have his book in French, Robert Cantillon. He spoke both French and English. I have it in French. So, the problem is this printing always fails eventually. So as Voltaire said, Voltaire being one of the philosophers in the sort of time of the French Revolution, he said, paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value, which is zero. And we're sort of seeing that in case by case. So we saw that recently in Argentina. And, I will tell you that I was in Argentina around 2015, and they were like, wow, we've finally solved our inflation problem. No problem anymore. Well, guess what happened? Boom. Again, it goes completely crazy. So inflation, you may think you've solved inflation, but no, you haven't solved inflation. It can come and kill you on a moment's notice. I can tell you that having been in Buenos Aires at exactly that time for an ICANN meeting, we didn't see this inflation rate coming back, and it completely decimated anybody who had savings in Argentina. Now, more recently in COVID, right, we had a very simple thing. We had money printing that went right up until 2020, in November of 2020, September of 2021, it rose, and then they tightened it, okay? So this was the reaction to COVID. Let's print more money. And what happened to the dollar value purchasing power? Completely collapsed right until the point where they started the tightening. Okay, so cause and effect. That's it. It's very simple. And if they print more, it will debase the currency. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, it doesn't matter, printing is not the same as lending to banks and all this stuff, but eventually it is the same. Printing leads to inflation, leads to the dollar being worth less. Okay, so the biggest problem is we can't trust the banks. That's the biggest problem. And, one of the things when I was working with Lee, our designer on this, said, I really want you to come up with these sort of very minimalistic things, like a few words on a page, just blank. I said, think about it almost like the Museum of Modern Art. You're coming and you see it like a word like truth or something. Like this is like a Barbara Kruger painting or something. It's just a few words you say more with less. And this is a great quote by Satoshi. He goes, the root problem of conventional currency is the trust that's required to make it work. The central bank must be trusted to not debase its currency. But the history of fiat currencies is full of breaches of that trust. So this was the first idea of Bitcoin. How can we make something a currency where you don't have to trust in that person? Okay, that's the fundamental reason of fundamental idea. How do you make it trustless? Now, Satoshi said, here's the thing. Centralized systems like the spider, okay, have a problem. You can just get the center of the thing and take it out, and the whole system breaks. But Satoshi noticed that pure P2P networks like Nutella and Tor seem to be holding their own. And he said this in November of 2009. So if you have a decentralized system, and Rod Beckstrom, who was the CEO of ICANN, when I was heavily involved with ICANN, he wrote a book called The Starfish and the Spider. And he said, the starfish, you can cut off one of the legs, it'll grow a new leg. Doesn't matter. There is no center for a starfish. Spider has a head. You can cut it off. So Satoshi realized the solution for this is to go after decentralized systems. So that was a fundamental observation that Satoshi made that really helped him solve this problem. So now let's talk about the foundation of Bitcoin. How did we understood that there's this problem that you can't trust the banks, that money printing always leads to inflation, and that somehow decentralization is the solution. But how do we go about solving this? Okay, well, it's a complicated road. Okay, and this is the timeline, and you can trace their origin back from 1976. So in 1976, two researchers one of which I think was at Cornell, Diffie. And Diffie and Hellman and their older mentor, Robert Merkle, discovered public-private key cryptography. And I remember meeting Diffie and Hellman, or seeing them. I was a grad student. Just finished my undergrad in math at Cornell. And they came to visit and gave us a little lecture, I think back in 1980. So not long after they had invented public-private cryptography. And so they were the first people to come up with this notion of a public key. You can show the public key around, but your private key is the one thing that unlocks things. And it wasn't used at all for money at this point. It was meant for encoding messages. Then we get the next breakthrough. The next breakthrough is David Chaum. And we're going to go through all of this, but I just want to go over individually. Chaum says, wait a second, we've got this system of cryptography. How about we use this thing for money? And maybe there's a way we can use cryptography for money, okay? And so that was Chaum's breakthrough idea, right? Let's use this thing for money. And this sort of emerges out of his PhD thesis at Berkeley, and he develops the very first system of cryptocurrency for money, which is DigiCash. Ultimately fails, but it was the first one that tried to do it. Then we get to the original concept of proof of work. So one of the key things that was missing from Chaum's thing is he did still require a certain amount of trust. Now, in order to get away from the trust problem, you had to do something that could be independently verified. Now, as it turned out, that thing was solving a mathematical cryptographic puzzle. And the first application of that was to prevent spam in email. And so this was done by two researchers, Dwork and Nayor, and this was presented at Chaum's paper, a symposium, cryptography symposium in Santa Barbara in 1992. Now, it just happened that I am very good friends with Cynthia Dwork. And the reason I am is that Cynthia Dwork's husband was my co-founder in my second startup, Random Noise. And so David Fuchs and I, we were hanging out in 95, and and he was like, well, Cynthia's got some interesting stuff and we should talk about those things. And I go, what is it? She's like, well, it's this proof of work stuff. People will work and, they'll do work in terms of solving these puzzles. And then this will solve spam. Do you think so, Fred? And, I was working with David and we were like, that doesn't sound very promising. I don't think proof of work's going to go anywhere. Obviously, none of us had any vision that this was going to amount to anything in terms of cryptocurrency. But this was it was invented in 92, and I kind of got to know Cynthia in 95. And we hung out a lot. And so then we have the NSA. The NSA now is coming up with the SHA-256, first SHA-1 and then SHA-256, right? Starting in 1993. And then they present a paper called How to Make a Mint, which is sort of like, it's widely cited as one of these things where they say the NSA invented Bitcoin. They didn't invent Bitcoin, but they did start piecing the pieces together, and we'll cover a little bit of that. Now, in 1997, proof of work is rediscovered by Adam Back in a way. And, there's a really interesting video online with Laura Shin, David Chaum, and Adam Back, where Chaum's like, how could you say you discovered it? It was discovered back here, and you had to know about my symposium. And Adam says, no, I didn't know about your symposium. But to Adam's credit, his version of it is much closer to, in fact, it is referenced in the Satoshi white paper. So ultimately, his version was the right version, I would say. What Naor and Dwork came up with was sort of solving square root problems and other things that were not actually, they didn't have certain mathematical properties that you would want in a proof of work system. And they didn't use, because SHA was not invented yet, so they didn't use SHA, right? So now we have proof of work Hashcash for email. Next year, we have two very significant attempts. One was BitGold by Nick Szabo, and the second is B-Money by Wei Dai. And both of them are sort of conceptual papers, but I think they start really getting into the elements of what Bitcoin could be. How can we make something that is a proof of work cryptocurrency that involves solving problems for work and then getting rewarded by getting units of this cryptocurrency. Now, this cryptocurrency, BitGold, it's a crazy idea, but it seems crazy in retrospect because you see the solution that Satoshi came. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the problems that BitGold had and B-Money had, and where they kind of failed to get the ultimate solution. And then we have Hal Finney, who then later, 6 years later, takes their work and actually codes it up into something called RPOW, reasonable proof of work. And that's probably the closest to Satoshi, what Satoshi discovered 4 years later. Okay, so that's this part here. Okay, so now let's talk about public and private keys. So we have here Merton, Hellman, and Diffie. And they are at Stanford. This is the old computer paper. I was at Stanford, I did a PhD at Stanford. And we were using these old IBM printouts of these computer paper printouts. And so this is them looking at over a code printout. And these are the founders of cryptography, in my view. These are the guys, these three guys are the guys who led the whole thing, right? Not cryptocurrency, but cryptography. So these three guys started it, and Diffie, we got this picture from Stanford. We got the rights from Stanford, and we called up Diffie, and he was like, "Oh, right, you're writing a book. Can we use the picture?" "Oh yeah, sure, that's great." And then we said, we'll send you a book, which we did. And he said, "Much obliged." So the Southern gentleman, he's about 80 years old now, but I think this is a fantastic sort of vision of where we were in terms of cryptography in 1976. Okay. Next, of course, is David Chaum. And, I've had the pleasure now of meeting David Chaum a couple times and having lunch with David Chaum, visiting his house. And David, if you talk to him, he's like, "I invented blockchain." And I go, "Well, David, you didn't quite invent blockchain." And he goes, "I did." And he goes, "If you go to my thesis, you will see I talk about chains of blocks, and that the blocks can be chained together." And I go, "Well, you did do that." Okay, so the idea of chaining blocks together is a Chaumian idea. It was in his idea. And the idea of using this for money is also a Chaumian idea, right? And I said, "You didn't have proof of work." And he goes, "Oh, I didn't have proof of work." So that was the one thing that Chaum was really kind of missing. There was other things, but I would say the difficulty adjustment is another one. But anyways, these are the first of Chaum, I think. First to propose digital cash. First to propose an implementation of what is called cryptographic blind signatures. He's the first person to introduce pseudonyms and privacy. So it was very privacy focused. And, in talking to Chaum says, "Listen, part of the thing is the NSA," he was fighting the NSA all the way at this point. And it was really a question of we can't let the NSA win, right? And so Chom was just, a real advocate for freedom and a lot of this spirit now is sort of missing from cryptography, right? And especially we can talk as we get into the institutionalization of all this stuff with the ETFs and so on. It's taken a very different direction from where it was in 1982 when Chom invented anonymous digital cash. So he was just a giant in terms of his impact on the field. And while he didn't end up with all the toys. He is not a billionaire. He was the inventor of cryptocurrency. Okay, now this is a great quote, and we felt like it deserved 2 pages. The difference between a bad electronic cash system and a well-developed digital cash system will determine whether we have a dictatorship or we are living in a real democracy. Chom, 1996. So Chom realized that cryptography is really ultimately as important to human freedom because there's always these different totalitarian tendencies. And totalitarian tendencies, we're seeing it now in Europe under Christine Lagarde, who's talking about this digital euro. And, Chom realized if we can have self-sovereign money, if we can hold our own money, that the government can't take that money from you, and it's well built, that's a huge deal, right? And I still feel like that. That is, to me, ultimately the power of Bitcoin is the ability for you to hold your own Bitcoin and not have a very easy way at all for the government to get that Bitcoin. And that's a key fact. And people are like, well, why shouldn't I buy just the ETF? Well, that's why. It's so you can hold your own Bitcoin, and some lawyer, some government guy in whatever country you happen to be in, that's why you need to have Bitcoin. That was the fundamental investment. And it goes back to Chom, right? This notion that you need to hold your own stuff. So this was a thought that was already there in 1996. And now we go to my friend Cynthia. There it is. This is my friend David Fuchs, who gave me this photo. He took this photo at Harvard, where Cynthia is a professor now. And Cynthia's not in love with Bitcoin. You would think that having authored the seminal paper on proof of work, she might be pro Bitcoin, but she's not. So she does feel that it is a waste of resource, and she does buy that thing. So we're not in agreement on that, but that's Cynthia at Harvard, and I'll know on March 27th whether my son gets into Harvard. I hope he does. That's one of the places he wants to go, but we'll see. Anyways, Cynthia, this is the story that I recounted about Cynthia and David and I. And so, part of it is like, I feel like I have this thing to tell the world. I mean, I kind of was indirectly part of the story of the growth of Bitcoin and proof of work. So it's very interesting. Now, this is, hold on one second. I'm holding this book up a second. Let's go to now Adam Back and Hashcash, right? So this is a summary of Adam's contributions to it. Adam, invented this concept of the nonce, or number used once, which is really part of the core Bitcoin code now. And, here is the original paper, Hashcash, the original paper in the cypherpunk mailing list. So at this point, we now have this movement of cypherpunks, who are these very privacy-focused people trying to come up with a solution that, just like we had individual personal computers, they wanted to have personal money that didn't depend on the state. And it was really almost like an anarchist movement. There's people feeling like we got to do this. We got to combat the system. Really had sort of this Abby Hoffman feel to it, and that's what cryptography was back then, and it was dangerous, right? And people forget this, but this was, you could potentially go to jail for the rest of your life for doing these things. So it was you were very much at odds with the system. Now, then we get to B money, right? And I told you about Wei Dai and Nick Szabo in 1998, and this is just a composite of Wei Dai because there is no picture of Wei Dai on the internet, period. And we know this because when we reached out to Wei and we had a few conversations on public Twitter, public FAQ on his website, he is active still. And he said, "Thank you for not putting a picture of me in your book because there are no pictures of me on the internet." And that tells you something, that some of these people have gone to immense lengths, immense lengths to protect their identity and their privacy. And Wei Dai is like that. He's a mystery. He filed a patent with Microsoft, but I can't figure out where Wei Dai lives, where he works. I can't find any information on him other than his his website. That's it. So, Wei Dai, you are a mystery. Could you be Satoshi? You might be. I don't know. Are you real? I don't know. You may not be a real person. I don't know. So if you know Wei Dai, if you're friends with Wei Dai, let me know. I'm curious. But this is an important statement by Satoshi. Bitcoin is an implementation of Wei Dai's B-money proposal in 1998 and Nick Szabo's BitGold proposal. So after the fact, Satoshi said it's an implementation of B-money and Nick Szabo. After the fact. Now, interesting that neither of these two people are named in the white paper. Neither of the two people. And, I asked Wei Dai this, and I was like, well, how come you're not in the white paper? Because Satoshi did use your C++, your Crypto++ library. Why is that? And he's like, well, he probably just wanted to get a little bit more efficient library than the more standard one out there. Okay, maybe. But anyway, so this is the B-money paper. Now, very interesting paper, very interesting ideas. Very short, very compact, even more compact than the white paper, actually, but full of very interesting ideas. Now we get to BitGold. And Nick Szabo is another one of these people who's an enigma, a polymath, a scientist, a philosopher, and a computer scientist. And Nick worked with David Chaum at DigiCash, as did Hal Finney. And we talked with David, and I said, "Was Nick there?" And he's like, "Yeah, Nick was there. Nick was hanging out." This is in Amsterdam, right? So they were funded by Philips, of all companies, the big electrical company, and they were kind of building this DigiCash system in Amsterdam, and Nick was there. In 1998. Both Nick and Wei Dai went to University of Washington, but separated by 8 years, with University of Washington in the state of Washington. And both studied computer science, right? So Nick's a little older. Hal Finney is a little older still. And all three of them, Nick, Hal Finney, and Wei Dai, were all members of this club called the Extropians. They were all very interested in how man could adapt to living on other planets and so on. So this is a really interesting. And by the way, Giovanni, the Power Law, is also an Extropian. So this goes deep. Some of these things. So, anyways, Szabo created this really interesting idea, and it's almost involved NFTs. Okay, so this is kind of my rendition of kind of Szabo's BitGold. And so what he does is he has these problems, right? And you solve these problems, and the problems are in various difficulty, right? And you solve a problem and you get a record of you solving the problem. So this is this, and they're linked together in this chain, very similar to Chom's chain of blocks that he wrote in his 1982 thesis, right? And this is, they called it a hash chain, okay? And so basically we have these title registries, right? That are also saved. Like every time you solve one of these puzzles, you get an NFT saying you solved this particular puzzle. Now, the problem is, and now I can take these different solutions and I can trade them, right? So I can say, oh, I'm sorry, this one went to this guy. It was traded. So it's a bunch of these records of these NFTs that are being traded. Now, then Nick talks about, well, you can combine them. Let's say you have a more valuable one, a hard one. You can combine it with a little less valuable one to make, to make a certain amount of money, right? Because you may need 3 of these guys and 2 of these guys to pay a bill. It was a very impractical idea, but you can sort of see the problem here. One of the problems that both Szabo and Wei Dai saw was that if you have these kind of proofs of work, these NFTs, you need to sort of standardize them into units, because it's inevitable that computers are getting faster and faster and cheaper according to Moore's law. So how do we value the early proofs of work more than the later proofs of work? And both of them sort of came up with ideas on this, and they were like, well, it's a little bit like NFTs, where you sort of say the early ones are worth more than the later ones, right? And they even talked about having indexes of technology adoption, and we'd sort of use those to kind of prorate the old ones more than the new ones and so on. So it's a very complicated system. It never was put into practice by Nick Szabo. It was just sort of a theoretical paper. I don't actually think it was 100% well thought out in terms of could it be put in practice, but Hal Finney does take this to the next level and writes a piece of code for it 4 years later called RPOW, Reusable Proof of Work. And so, again, the code never goes anywhere. It's just a sort of theoretical implementation. And so that brings us to 2004. Now we've gone through, there's one other player here. The other player is, while you have all these cypherpunks and extropians doing all this stuff, you have this other Darth Vader type force, which is the NSA. The NSA is housed in this black cube, right? And it's literally this is where Snowden is, right? This is where the government is trying to keep tabs on everybody and spy on people and prevent freedom in a way, but in the name of protecting the United States. So the NSA was started in 1952, right during the peak of the Cold War, right? And they come up with this paper called How to Make a Mint, okay? And this paper is, it's remarkable, this paper. And this paper is remarkable, right? And there are some similarities to Bitcoin. It uses cryptography. It has digital signatures, so there's the same notion of signatures that exist in Bitcoin and all modern cryptographies, cryptocurrencies. and it eliminates third parties. So it is a sort of peer-to-peer system. However, there are differences. This paper is focused on pure anonymity. Bitcoin is not anonymous, it's pseudonymous. So if you know the identity of a person, of an address, then you can trace all kinds of things. You can now find out, you can find out the entire path and maybe where the exchange happened between, you can go back through the chain, like chainalysis. There's offline capabilities, right? So they saw the need to actually allow for offline transactions. So it actually mentions this a little bit, but the offline nature is not available in Bitcoin. Bitcoin does require propagation through a network. It is an online-only system. This proposal, like DigiCash, uses a central authority, not surprising for the NSA, because they wanted backdoors to everything, to manage the currency. Now, Bitcoin, as we will see, is completely and utterly decentralized, right? It does not have a central authority. And this is the breakthrough, right? They discuss the core problem in Bitcoin, which is the double spend, right? And they solve it using a centralized approach. Bitcoin solves it using a decentralized approach, proof of work. And they talk about scalability and portability, but Bitcoin really goes 100% the way in terms of scalability and portability. So again, you can look at these things and you can say, well, they discovered it. Well, they didn't discover it, but there are history rhymes, doesn't repeat. Okay, so now we get to the famous white paper. Okay, so while the rest of the world is melting, right, and we're having the great financial crisis, and all of us are worrying about losing all our money in the stock market, at least I was, Satoshi comes out with this epic paper, which was really, one of the great papers of all times. AI doesn't have this paper. AI has this Transformers paper, which ended up being, the seminal discovery of AI. But Bitcoin has this PDF white paper that comes out on October 31st, Halloween, 2008. Now, this is an incredible, short, terse, amazing paper. And it is all of 8 pages long, no math, very little math, and a page of references. So it lays out Bitcoin with some completely new concepts, completely new that nobody's ever thought of. One is that the transactions are stored in blocks. We saw there's a little bit of similarity with the Chaumian chains of blocks here. But here's the crucial difference. These blocks are created at regular intervals. And the difficulty in creating a block is dynamic. It keeps on changing. So there's this notion of the difficulty adjustment in creating a block. And the crazy thing is there's this game theory that keeps the ledger honest. And when you first look at it, you're like, how does that work? And then, we'll see that it actually does work. It's just pure game theory. What it doesn't mention is a few things. It doesn't mention finite supply, and it doesn't mention voluntary transaction fees, both of which are absolutely critical, and both of which appear in the final code written 3 months later, right? It doesn't call nodes miners either. This idea of mining comes out a little later, and it doesn't use the word blockchain at all. That's not in the white paper. Okay, so it does mention that we do kind of have the idea of finality, right? And this is a new idea, right? Which is, if I send something to you, you cannot reverse it back to me, right? Now, when I first came across Bitcoin, I was like, well, this is not good. This is a defect of this, because most consumers would like to get their money back somehow if they don't like the transaction. And American Express says that if for some reason you don't like your transaction, call American Express, you'll get your money back, right? And a lot of people get caught up on that. And Bitcoin is final. If I send you Bitcoin, I can ask for you to give it back. Pretty please, will you give me my Bitcoin back? But unfortunately, you can just say no. In fact, there may be no way of communicating with you. You are just an address in cyberspace. So you're just a hash of some random piece of numbers. So it's final and it's tamper-proof. Like, nobody can touch this. Nobody can create fake transactions, not fakeable. And you said, well, surely everything's fakeable. No, it is absolutely not fakeable. And that's the mathematics of cryptography that ensures that. And this is a great quote by Satoshi, which says, with the possibility of reversal, the need for trust spreads. So he said, listen, I can't have a system that allows for reversals, because if I did, I'm going to need to trust somebody. And I can't trust anybody. I don't know. Who can I trust? The government? Well, we're now deeply divided in the US. The Democrats don't trust the Republicans don't trust the Democrats. How about if you live in Nigeria? Can you trust the Bank of Nigeria, the government of Nigeria? I certainly can. What about if you live in a totalitarian country like Russia? Can you trust the government? No. The government barely trusts each other branches of its own government. So nobody trusts anybody, and that's the system that Bitcoin is built for, right? And so Satoshi realizes his other statement that the only way to confirm the absence of a double spend is to be aware of all transactions. This is an amazing concept. It basically says we need to have a record of every single transaction since the very first transaction. So Satoshi realizes, I'm going to need to keep everything. I'm going to keep a complete record of every transaction on Bitcoin for eternity, since the beginning of time. Okay, well, once we have that idea, we better make sure these transactions are really tiny, right? They keep very, very small amount of them. No, we're not saving images and we're just keeping these transactions really small, and we want to basically transmit the entire block, the entire record of all Bitcoin transactions. Many, many people are going to hold that thing, and that's what the case right now. So if you run a Bitcoin node, okay, you have a record of every single Bitcoin transaction since the Genesis block. And that right now is under a terabyte of data. So it'll fit on a $10 thumb drive. And you can walk around, you can have every single transaction. As long as you keep this thing up to date, you can do this thing very, very inexpensively. And we'll get to that in the block wars. I just realized now we're not going to get more than page 60 of this thing. But we're going to probably break this up into multiple things. So let's see if we can get through the white paper today. But I'm enjoying this kind of spreading of the thing. So the core problem of Bitcoin is now, how do we avoid double spends? And what do I mean by that? Well, if I send something to you and then 3 minutes later I say I'm going to send the same thing to somebody else, how do I make sure that you get the thing and not somebody else? How do you make sure that I'm not a bad actor and I send the same piece of digital information to two parties, right? That's a really important problem, right? Now, fundamentally, you see, this is the main problem with digital things. They're not scarce. You can copy and paste a digital picture, and you get another digital picture that looks exactly like the digital picture you copied and pasted. And so we have this very derogatory way of talking about Bitcoin art as JPEGs, right? There's nothing unique about the art because I can copy and paste it. But how do you create something digital that's completely scarce? Well, you need to you need to transmit in that thing a cryptographic hash, and you need to be aware of every single transaction. So starting with these things, Satoshi now said, okay, I got to be aware of every single transaction in the white paper, okay? Then he's like, okay, how do I commit these things to this register of transactions? Well, in order to do that, I'm going to use this proof of work idea that Adam Back recently popularized. It was kind of invented before by Cynthia and Moni Naor. And basically, I'm going to say, in order to push something to the register, you're going to have to do some proof of work. That's it. And how do you get to push? Well, you're going to have to solve some very, very difficult mathematical problem, very difficult computational problem. That will give you the right to write one block, right? And you will get all your transactions for that one block, about 4,000 transactions per current block. And you're going to be rewarded by getting 3 Bitcoin by doing that. That's kind of the current setup, you know. You do this thing, you put those 4,000 transactions in a block, and you're going to get these 3 Bitcoin. And good luck trying to get that block on your own. That block is going to be, you are competing now with 3 million computers, and you're competing with 30 nuclear reactors worth of electricity and 3 million dedicated miners just to solve that one block. That's how intense the competition is. So this proof of work it's completely decentralized, and now we found a way to ensure that there's not going to be a schedule of people who make that block. It's entirely a winner takes all competition between all these miners, and that is this idea of mining these regularly spaced blocks is key. Now, when Satoshi writes this paper, the response is completely underwhelming. Nobody seems to care, and people on the mailing list, they've seen all these proposals before. They're like, wait a second, this is like, man, we saw DigiCash, that didn't work. We saw this, saw BitGold, that didn't work. We saw Hal Finney, that whatever. This is another one of these things. We're not interested. And so and they were like, well, this thing does not seem to scale. This is not going to cut it. So, anyways, 2 weeks later, a pre-release version of the code was sent to Hal Finney, Ray Dillinger, and James A. McDonald via private email. And these 3 give Satoshi feedback on the 0.1 reference client for Bitcoin. Now, did any of them contribute? Did Hal Finney contribute? We don't know. In any case, on January 3rd, 2009, version 0.1 of Bitcoin was released with the Genesis block of Bitcoin built into the code with the message in the code base. It was 5 days later when the first blocks were mined. Now, this is really important. Satoshi didn't just release it and start mining. He waited until there was nodes online, right, that he could mine and compete with those nodes for mining. That's it. So, you know, it took 5 days for the first block. And of course, Satoshi never spent any of his blocks. So I'm going to go over this one piece now, which is the Bitcoin 1.0. And we're going to go there and we're going to stop after that, right, for today. That'll be today's reading. So let's talk about Bitcoin 1.0, right? 0.1. Okay, Bitcoin 0.1. So this is the famous Genesis block. And by the way, we have posters of this that we've made, and hopefully we can get some of them. I need to go dig out where some of those posters are, but we have some of these posters of the Genesis block, and you can see in the block there's the code from the Times, the London Times, basically indicating time stamping the block with the fact that it says Chancellor on the brink of bailout, so the second bailout for banks. Okay, there's two reasons why I think this is important. One is it timestamps the Genesis block, and second of all, it sort of indicates, hey, I've got a solution to this banking problem. So I think Satoshi knew, even though Bitcoin did not roar out of the gate, right? For the first year, it was a very, very slow beginning. Didn't roll out of the gate, but Satoshi knew that he had solved the problem. He knew he had solved the problem, and so he kind of snuck this little Easter egg in there, saying, "I got you. I've solved this problem of banking." And we tried to get this Chancellor on the brink from the Times, and we said, "We'll pay you. We'll pay you whatever." And they came back like, "Oh, we're in touch with the licensing." And then they said, "No, we can't actually allow you to reprint that page from the London Times." I'm very interested in why they would have done that, because we were in touch with them for like a month and going back and forth, and they ultimately decided not to. I think they don't like Bitcoin. Or maybe they make so much money by selling those copies or something. I don't know. But we couldn't get permission to get the actual London Times thing, which you see reproduced some places illegally, but we actually wanted to get official things. So let's talk about what was so unique about this white paper, or this code, right? Not the white paper. There are four key innovations that I can see, that Ben and I can see. The first was blocks are produced at regular intervals, okay? This second is this finite supply. The third is how the consensus rules work. It's not rules, but how consensus is formed. And the fourth is voluntary transaction fees. So here we have some of the original code. The code, by the way, is very short, okay? We're talking 30,000 lines of code, which is not huge for Bitcoin 0.1. You can download the code, it's readable. It's not bad. It's not perfect. So it doesn't strike me. I'm not a pro coder. I'm a coder, but I'm not a pro coder. I can read the Bitcoin code. It's well-written code. But it's not perfect, and it had bugs. So let's go over these four things, okay? The four things. The first is blocks produced at regular intervals. Now, this is, if I had to say one thing, this is the thing I would say. And here is the problem, as Satoshi said. As computers get faster and the total computing power applied to creating Bitcoins increases, the difficulty increases proportionally to keep the new production constant. Thus, it is known in advance how many new Bitcoins will be created every year in the future. So basically, Satoshi said, I'm going to try to set this algorithm up so that roughly every 10 minutes, we're going to have a new block that comes online. So that's the first thing. How do I do that? Well, what I do is I figure out over the last interval how many blocks were created, and then I adjust. If more blocks were created than I expect, then I increase the difficulty. So the next time, less blocks are created. So this is a very simple little code, and it's very little code. This is the entire code that does the difficulty adjustment, okay, in the Bitcoin code. So that was the solution. So now we have a code where the blocks are happening at regular intervals, every 10 minutes, okay? And that 10 minutes, by the way, is chosen for a reason, right? If you compress it too much, you're going to have too much information to push to all the computers. And so he felt that was not good. So this was sort of like a security slash performance compromise. Okay, a lot of these things are sort of compromises, and you're not building it for a specific moment in time, but for a very long period of time going forward. So again, the point here is not to get the fastest thing, it's to get the most secure thing on the planet, right? The second thing was this concept of finite supply, right? So basically, the first block came out with a 50 Bitcoin reward per block. And after 2,100,000, 210,000 blocks, we cut the supply down to 25. I cut the reward to 25 Bitcoin per block. And if you just sum these things up, you get a geometric series that sums to 21 million. Right? There you get your final 21 million, which is the kind of max supply, right? And this is the code that ensures that the supply is 21 million. So people say, hey, Fred, how do we know it's 21 million? You look at this code. Now, could they change the code? Sure, they could, but it's very, very unlikely that any change to the code would be considered Bitcoin. So the version of the code that didn't change would be considered Bitcoin. The version that did change would not be considered Bitcoin, in my opinion. That's how the 21 million cap is done. So, and we can talk a little bit later about how, actually, again, this cap was not mentioned in the white paper. And there was even notion of, well, maybe we have an inflation problem that we need to address. But somewhere between August 2008 and January 2009, that problem was solved. We had this finite supply of 21 million that was codified, literally, into the code. And we had this system of halvenings. That was done in the last 3 months of 2008. Okay, now we get to this Nakamoto Consensus, okay? Well, how do we know that these blocks, how do we solve for bad actors trying to put stuff into the blocks, right? Well, this is really interesting, okay? And it's really game theory. Let me see if I have this diagram. Yeah. So there's very short little thing in the white paper about, the probability of catching up to a block. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, ooh, Poisson density. Now, this is something I actually know a lot about. And having studied queuing theory and Poisson stochastic processes quite a bit, I realized that, yeah, this is exactly right. And let me probably stop here at the end of here. But this is sort of why Bitcoin works, right? So you have here a bunch of blocks that are mined, right? And you have an attacker who's coming up and he wants to attack the Bitcoin blockchain, right? And so he comes and he pre-mines these 3 blocks, right? And the question is, can he compete with this 6 block mine? And can he actually overtake the chain? Well, if you do the math, you realize that his chances of doing that go down exponentially, right? And even if he has, 10% of the entire hash power, the chance of him getting even beyond 3 blocks is minuscule. Okay, and 6 blocks, you're talking, 1 in a million chance of getting. That's why they say 6 blocks, 6 confirmations, 100%. Even 2 confirmations is pretty good, but the probability of getting past this is almost 0. And because if you mine a block and you do it and your block is rejected, right, you will not get the Bitcoin reward. So the game theory says that you will be honest. You will not put bad transactions in your block. You will not do that because you do not want to be orphaned out, okay, and not get your block reward. It's so difficult to mine 1 block, and you do not want to lose your block, okay? And the last thing is voluntary transaction fees. Okay, this is This is really important. And here's the quote. There will be transaction fees, so nodes will have an incentive to receive and include all the transactions they can. Nodes will eventually become compensated by transaction fees alone when the total coins created hits the predetermined ceiling. So this whole process of minting new blocks and getting rewards ends in 2140. And at that point, it'll only be fees going to Bitcoin. But Bitcoin can exist for thousands of years just on fees alone. But we sort of jump started with this mining thing. So for all of our lifetime, we're going to be dealing with mining blocks. But eventually, we will just go to fees alone. Now, the fees have been at times as high as the block rewards. And we saw that right around last happening. In April of last year, the fees actually exceeded the block rewards at times because of this thing called ordinals happening and runes. Anyways, the last thing is here, the references are telling, okay? What do we have in this references? Well, we have a few things that are interesting. We have Weidai, B-money reference. Why? Because the paper went to Adam Back first, and then Adam said, hey, you should check out Weidai stuff. And Satoshi said, Weidai, never heard of him. Okay, maybe. But, he's not in there. Nick Szabo's not in there. Alfini's not in there. Kind of interesting that none of those guys are in there, but Adam Back is. It's a little odd. Why is Trom not in there, for example? So, you do have Back that's in there, and Back references Trom. So, does he reference Trom? I don't know if he does, actually. But the references are a little interesting. Now, the other thing that you'll see is there's a lot of notion of timestamping, right? So timestamping is kind of a clear idea that's really important to Satoshi, right? Because you want to have these secure timestamps, right, on these transactions. And this is, I don't want to go into it too much here, but that's it for the references. I think very short paper, very short selection of references, and that's it. One last thing here. There are no Bitcoins in the code. The code does not mention Bitcoins. It only mentions Satoshis. And we have, 10 to the power -8 Satoshis, or 10 to the power 8 Satoshis to the Bitcoin, 100 million Satoshis to the Bitcoin. And it's interesting why that number was picked. And Satoshi said, I wanted to choose something that was right in the middle. And what do you mean by that? Well, if you have a 16-bit number and you have 8 below the decimal and 8 above the decimal, you get basically where Bitcoin is. So that is it. And later at some point, we're going to go into the early days of Bitcoin, but I think I covered the beginning of Bitcoin in this thing. Again, if you can afford it, I would recommend you buy the Big Bitcoin book. It is not cheap. It is $300. But I will tell you, it is, a better book on Bitcoin there is not. Is it cheap? No. Can we make a lot more of them? We can, but we aren't going to. And honestly, it's a labor of love. Why did I do this? Because I love Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin's been very, very good to me. Now we have sold about $500,000 worth of these books, so we've actually made money on the book. And this book is a bestseller, in terms of dollars. So I'm very happy with the book, and I don't talk about it much right now because I'm working on other things, mainly in AI and some stuff that I'll share in about a little less than a month. But yeah, I love Bitcoin. I love the people behind Bitcoin. I love the ideas of Bitcoin. And, while I may not agree with all the maxis everywhere on all things Bitcoin, I think we're aligned and that we see something absolutely amazing with this invention that Satoshi gave us. And so that's kind of my story on Bitcoin, and I will leave you with that. So, see, a little chat. Superbook, well written. Thanks. Copies in the lead. Thanks, Walter. Okay, I'm not going to do my normal Q&A here. I gotta hop.